Every once in a while I have to leave my studio, and no, this is not my studio, this is a building under construction. But every once in a while I have to work remotely, and normally this is when I have to create a wall painting or a mural, a type of job that doesn't come very often to an oil painter who works primarily on canvas. But thankfully, with experience and a lot of experimentation with my process over the years, it's the kind of job that I can sort of create my own rules around and figure out ways to do it, even if it's something I've never done before. And in this video, I'm going to be showing you my most recent example of such a job. In this case, an acrylic mural of professional runners going about their morning jog or training routine. This painting is located at a training camp in Eldoret, which is the region of Kenya from where most of our marathon runners originate. And the landscape in the painting itself is going to be designed to mirror the local environment as well. And so using a roller, I start by covering the section of the wall on which I'm going to paint with a dark background color. And in this case, it's not just one color, but a gradation of values from a sort of lighter version of the shadows at the very top to the darker ones at the bottom. The logic behind it being that the shadows that are closest to us, and in this case the part of the painting that's going to be at the lower section of this wall, are going to appear darker than the ones further away from us, in this case the ones closer to the middle of the wall. A few reasons why a roller is more efficient than a brush for this process are that number one, because of its big size, it's able to hold more paint, and so I don't have to keep loading it all the time. Also, for the same reason, it covers a larger surface area than a brush would, and so it will take me a less amount of time for me to finish this section. And the third reason is that since the roller is made from softer fabric that almost makes it feel like a cushion, I'm able to push paint into the grooves and the small holes on this wall with far less effort than I would with a Bristol brush. And so on this background that looks like a Mark Rothko painting, I'm going to draw a grid using chalk, and this is what I'm going to use to ensure that the proportions of the image I'm going to be painting will be right on the wall as they are in the sketch I'll be following from my phone. There are varied ways of achieving accurate proportions in painting or drawing, and maybe I'll cover those in a future video. But what makes the use of grids the more effective technique in this particular case is that even though easier and probably quicker methods of achieving the correct proportions, like say using a projector, would work for a wall this big, being that it's an outdoor scene, it would be impossible to see the image that's being projected onto the wall easily. And the alternative on the other end of the spectrum, which would be doing it freehand, would likely require a lot of correction and hence end up taking an inordinate amount of time. Normally when painting the outlines on canvas paintings, I use oil paints, but in this case I'm going to be using a brighter colored chalk. And this is for a couple of reasons, one of them being I don't have my tablet on my side, and so there's no surface for me to place the oil paints and the solvents. And the second reason being that unlike in my oil paints, this background is going to be visible at the end of the painting. So I'm going to need to use materials that I can easily erase, and chalk is a perfect example of such a material, unlike oil paints which would be pretty much permanent on the surface. This is never a problem in my canvas paintings because I'll then simply just paint over the outlines, and so in the final painting you won't be able to see them. But thanks to the lack of that option in this painting, chalk will have to do this time. And so with the outlines done, first I'm gonna try not to fall on this unstable ground. But the next step is now to very carefully erase the straight horizontal and vertical lines that form the grid and leave the outlines that I'm going to be using. And a brush that's loaded with water is a perfect tool to use for this particular step. As you can tell, the sun is now fully out and it's getting hot, which is not exactly a good thing, particularly because this means the acrylic paint that I have on my palette, in this case the plastic plate I'm holding, is going to be drying really fast, and so I have to keep remixing and removing the top dried layer all the time as I paint the underpainting. And so it's important that I mix more acrylic paint than I think I'm gonna need, because a lot of it is going to be wasted thanks to the high temperatures outside. As you'll also see, especially if you've watched my other videos, this time I'm not painting the underpainting using a gradient that flows from dark to light as I normally say. This time I'm using one color, and by changing the amount of pressure with which I apply the paint onto the wall, I'm able to create different gradients when I need them, and so some parts will appear darker than others. And the darkest shadows will simply be the parts of the background that I shall not have painted on with this bright, or rather relatively bright color that I'm using for my underpainting. Compared to my other way of creating underpaintings, this is a relatively quicker process, but one that's really rough on the brushes because it involves a lot of friction to be able to get these different gradients. And so in the process of creating this underpainting, I actually totaled a couple of small brushes, but it's been worth it, and the result is quite pleasing already to me, even though I'm barely halfway there with the painting. The next step is now to use another brush loaded with water to now get rid of the chalk outlines that were still visible. So you can't see the difference from this distance, but that's what I'm doing in this step. It's another day now and time to start coloring this artwork. You can see now that I'm using a lot more paint than I did in the previous step, and that's the reason why earlier I was using it sparingly, so that in sections where the shadows are supposed to be soft around the edges, when I paint this with the final color, the transition will go straight from the final color to the shadow, which is the darkest background that I applied earlier, and it won't have to pass through a bright underpainting color that I used in the previous step. And so carefully, bit by bit, I paint over the underpainting, and as you can tell, it's starting to come to life just by having painted the ground and nothing else. I created a fair amount of dust behind these runners so that when the sun hits the dust, it appears bright enough that the athletes look something like silhouettes, and so they stand out more than they otherwise would against this busy setting. And so the next step is to paint all the areas of this painting that are going to have that dust over it, even if they're far away into the distance. And the reason why I start with this is because it is those dust particles that accumulate the farther you go into the painting, at least visually from our vantage point, that are going to make everything that's far away appear blurry or kind of lighter. And so all the other colors that I'm going to paint for the landscape behind our foreground, which is where the runners are, in the middle ground where the big trees are going to have to be either mixed with the color of the dust or applied sparingly enough that the dust kind of shows. And so the hills on the horizon will come first, and this will appear incredibly bright, especially compared to the ones where the runners are or in the middle ground just behind them. And of course, thanks to the scattering of light and the distance between us and the hills in the background, they're going to appear bluer and fainter the further away from us they are. Next up is the shadows of the trees and shrubs that are in the background. And even though I won't paint these particular elements of the painting in detail, it's important to show at least a hint of them so that the background doesn't appear bare. For the vegetation, much of the detail will be in the trees that I'm painting now, and those are the ones in the middle ground. And so after painting the shadows of the outer outlines of the leaves, I'll then use a bluish green color to paint the trees and shrubs in the background, at least where the light hits them. There won't be much detail involved in this step because understandably we won't be able to see much detail even in real life, but it's a different story when it comes to the trees that are closest to us. And so with the appropriate colors of the leaves of these trees, I'm going to go through the painstaking process of painting the canopy or the crown of each tree leaf by leaf. Just to heighten the contrast, I'm going to be making the highlights extra sharp or extra bright in this case. But as bright as this color appears, it's a derivative of the color of the leaves of each of these trees, and not an independent color that has nothing to do with the kind of greens that I'm using for these leaves. After adding all these trees to this scene, it has now come to life even more than it did just by painting the ground earlier on, which is something that applies even in real life. And so with the background done, it's now time to move on to our characters in the foreground, which are the cattle and their herders passing by. and eventually the runners themselves. So I'm going to start with these cows. And the basic process I'll be using for this is by starting with the neutral color or the color of the hide, followed by the highlights or the parts that are going to appear brighter than the rest. The same will apply to the herders passing by and the two observers. And so after painting each of them with this process, it will be time to move on to the runners. The chalk outlines you see are new outlines that I've just drawn to remind myself of where the outline or the outermost limit of this particular figure is, and I'll do the same for the other runners. And afterwards I'm filling it up with the darkest color that I used earlier, just to paint over the sections of this particular figure and all the other figures where the colors for the background sort of trespassed into the section where only the runner is supposed to be. This is then followed by very simple midtones and highlights. And after just enough, and in this case a very few number of brush strokes that are just enough to give an idea of what the runner looks like and how the light hits him, it's time to move on to the next one. The second runner is wearing a yellow tracksuit jacket or warm-up suit, however you call it. And for the brighter parts to stand out, the areas in shadow are going to have to be extra dark just to increase that feeling of contrast when you finally apply the brighter parts or the highlights, as you can see. And so I'll go on to different parts of the jacket, adding more shadows and more highlights as is appropriate. And with the same process, I'll paint the next runner and the three to his left. On and on it goes, and finally, after 5 days of non-stop work in the morning cold and afternoon heat of Eldoret, we finally have ourselves a complete painting where the runners are now unleashed and will be able to live out their lives in an environment even more beautiful than I was able to capture in my artwork.